So the Phocians as a group is a relatively small ethnos, which I have taken a lovely map from the Barrington here and put on to show the sort of regional area. So they're a group who covers the Cephisus Valley, the Bay of Antisera, Delphi, and the plains of Crisa. And it's an ethnos that developed throughout the Archaic period, as many Greek ethnia did. And a large portion of the development would have been a consequence of Thessalian pressure, because quite often a prominent feature in developing identities is outside pressure, in this case from Thessaly. Thessaly presumably had a strong presence in Phocis throughout most of the 6th century after having established themselves as a dominating power in this region after the First Circuit War in the early 6th century. However, they suffered several setbacks in central Greece, such as the Battle of Keresus in Boeotia, and which I date to the mid-5th century, but I see it dated all over the place, everywhere from about 600 to far into the 5th century. But to me, it makes sense that it occurred in the mid-6th century. And following this, a weakening of Thessalian power in central Greece occurred, which led to a rebellion within Phocis as well, which McInerney has convincingly dated to around 510. Our principal source for the events in this rebellion is Herodotus, which is who we are here to talk about. And it has been suggested that he's using that the rivalry between the Thessalians and the Phocians are being used as a mirror of the hostilities between the Persians and the Athenians, which is not the discussion for this paper, but still an interesting comparison to mention. Because in this paper, I will focus on Herodotus' accounts of these events and analyze what they can tell us about the evolution of the Phocian ethnos and the role of the Phocians during Xerxes' invasion of Phocis, during Xerxes' invasion of Greece and Phocis. The Phocians, they did start this war on the Hellenic side, as they were represented at Thermopylae, and a portion of them did change sides after that, as 1,000 of them were recorded fighting with the Persians at Plataea. However, most of them still seem to have been on the Hellenic side and were raiding the Persians from behind, from Mount Parnassus. So throughout this paper, I shall refer to earlier to events retrospectively mentioned by Herodotus, localized Phocian stories, the importance of local topography, and putative mythological connections between the Phocians and the Thessalians. I'm going to start off with the Phocian Wall and the Battle of Thermopylae. Herodotus talks about the Phocian Wall in Book 7, Chapter 176, and talks about it as having been built as a precautionary measurement for the Phocians against Thessalian aggression. And according to Herodotus, it was meant to have occurred around the same time as when the Thessalians were supposed to have migrated from Thesprotia to Aeolis and closer to the Phocian territories. Stories of migration and settlements in the archaic Greek world are often constructed to explain origins of stories, relations to the neighbors, and mythological ties to the rest of the Hellenes. In this case, this wall is being at this point associated with the Phocians as a great forces coming in the north with the Thessalians. And stories like this forms in several parts of the Hellenic world at this point, as the political landscape of the Greek world transformed a lot in the geometric and archaic period. So archaic Phocis before the First Sacred War was presumably divided into regions controlled by smaller Hellenic ethnies, such as the Cargilidae at the Bay and Plains of Crisa. And I should have put in a map here because that would have been brilliant, but there's plenty of maps to come because I love maps. and also the Phocians, which were based around Panopes and Dolis, and potentially also into the Bay of Antisera, which leaves the areas as Cephisus, Thyatira, Elatea, and Hermopolis as an earlier Phocian ethnos, and the plains of Crisa as plains of Crisa and Antisera, and the Bay of Crisa as separate ethnos at this point. Strabo suggests that the early Phocians gained access to the sea to the north by conquering a corridor from Hermopolis to Daphnis in Locris, dividing eastern Locris into Epicnemidian and Opuntian Locris. So therefore it's possible that this early Phocian ethnos had a controlling interest in eastern Locris quite early on, before the Thessalian interference in central Greece. As this will gain them access to the sea for themselves. And Herodotus does suggest that this wall is ancient, and the ruins were already ruins by the time of the Battle of Thermopylae, therefore presumably dating back to the First Sacred War, so a potential defense against the Thessalian interference at that point. However, it has been suggested that the story of the Phocian Wall that survives through Herodotus has been altered, and instead it should be considered a defense against southern enemies rather than northern. And if this is considered correct, then the Phocian Wall should be considered to have been a Malian defense against the Phocians rather than the other way around, and before the rise of Thessaly. And if that is the case, then this must be considered to be corresponding with the event Strabo mentions with the Phocian conquest of Daphnis and military interference in eastern Locris. But the importance for this paper lies in what this wall can tell us about the Phocian ethnos, its relations to Thessaly, and how this wall was thought of in the Greek world. At least by the time of Herodotus, and probably from sometime in the 6th century, the wall had become associated with the Phocians and the struggle against the Thessalians. In this instance, the struggle presumably dates to the early 6th century and the semi-mythological First Sacred War, which led to a Thessalian dominance of central Greece, including all of Phocis, Delphi, Opuntian Locris, and western Boeotia. And it's after this war that the Kragalidae ethnos becomes associated with Croesus, as mentioned, who is mentioned as the son of Phocus from Aegina in this quote from the Catalogue of Women. Whilst another tribe called the Phrygians gets incorporated through another son of Phocus called Panopus, which also becomes, of course, affiliated with the important Phocian polis of Panopus. Delphi would, of course, remain with outside Phocian influence for quite a while, and one of the biggest thorn in the side of Phocis, because quite often the Phocians are trying to take it. But their rivalry between them can be seen in this quote already, as Crisa representing the areas around Delphi would have been, and Panopus associated with areas in Phocis, were rivals already in the mythology from before they were born. So, because through this mythology, the Phocians through the 6th century became associated with the region we now think of as Asian Phocis, encompassing a large part of the Cephisus Valley, the Bay of Antisera, and the plains of Crisa. And at the time of the Thessalian dominance in central Greece, it's presumable that they would have lost their control over Daphnis and any influence in Epicnemidian and Opuntian Locris. The Phocians might therefore, the Phocian Wall might therefore have been used by the Malians to defend themselves against Phocian aggressors earlier on in antiquity, before the Phocian rebellion against the Thessalian dominance in central Greece. So by the time of the Persian Wars, this defensive structure had become associated with the Phocians and the defenses against the northern adversaries in Thessaly. This wall later became an important part of the Hellenic defenses at Thermopylae, as Herodotus suggested, the Greeks rebuilt it as a defensive structure to help curb the invasion of the Persians. Thus, it's probable that before the First Sacred War, the Phocians had a controlling influence in this part of Locris. This should be considered to have been also considered to be the case following the rise of the Phocians sometime around 510 and the subsequent end of the Thessalian dominance in much of Phocis. The Phocians sent a rather large contribution to the Hellenic army at Thermopylae and numbered 1,000 heavy infantry. As I said. Herodotus informs us that the various Greek groupings fought in groups that were centered on their ethnic identities, which took terms on fighting again based on these groups, with the notable exception being the Phocian ethnos, which instead was placed upon the heights around Thermopylae to guard the hills and the paths against the Persians. Herodotus' account of this shows that that only the Phocians were put there and not the Oputian Locrians. The regions around Thermopylae would geographically have been within Epic and Median Locris. However, Epic and Median Locris isn't mentioned by Herodotus, who presumably talked of Oputian Locris area as Eastern Locris in general. Both these Locrians and the Phocians were present at Thermopylae with significant contributions. As I mentioned, 1,000 Phocians and the Locrians, every man available. Both groupings would have been familiar with these hills. Yet, as hinted at earlier, the Phocians had an invested interest in controlling this area, in controlling these passes. The Phocian interests here earlier on would have been twofolded. So protection from Thessaly and gain access to the sea. And it's likely they were put there because of their familiarity and historical knowledge of the hills and the passes in these mountains. Quite often, important aspects of identities lies in local geography and topographical features such as mountains, connection to the sea, plains, rivers. And for the Phocians, these mountains must have been considered an important part of the ability to defend their homeland. And the fact that they presumably might have had an earlier controlling influence there can be shown as the reason to why the Phocians were preferred to guard this rather than the Locrians. In book 7, chapter 215, Herodotus draws allusions to a Thessalian invasion of Phocis, as he talks about how the Malians had led Thessalian through this pass to attack the Phocians earlier on. In Herodotus, and presumably also in the localized traditions at this time, this was the invasion where the Phocians supposedly constructed the Phocian wall. And if we then could consider the wall not being built by the Phocians, but to defend against the Phocians, this must then refer to then the Phocians take over this wall and start using it for their own defenses against the northern enemies. So this presumably then should be dated back to the First Sacred War, or another potential one is before the Battle of the Amphora, which I'll go into more details of later. Right. But presumably this is in reference to the first of the two I mentioned. I'm sorry, I have a very dry mouth, so I have to keep drinking. And the reason why I think this must date to the First Sacred War rather than the Battle of than before the Battle of the Amphora is because Herodotus says the wall to have been very ancient by his day, and both would have been very ancient. That's true, but to me it makes more sense to put this in the First Sacred War. And it sort of because of this becomes an important part of this Thessalian Phocian rivalry in the Phocian way of thinking of it. But unfortunately, even though there's a great number of Phocians placed on top of these hills, and I have a lovely map here because maps are great. At the beginning of the path that leads up to where the Phocian troops are stationed, there's an oak forest. So sadly, they did not see the Persian troops coming when the Persians found their way around the Hellenic forces. This path followed the Thessalian river Asopus and eventually got up to a mountaintop. But as I said, there's an oak forest, so not really much point having the Phocians stationed where they are if they can't actually see anything. But they didn't see the Persians coming to begin with. But Malians and Thessalians led the Persians through this path towards the Phocians. However, when the Persian forces arrived at the top of the mountain, they can no longer escape the notice of the Phocians at the top. However, the Phocians were not ready for battle either. And as the Persians are approaching and preparing their archers and start firing arrows at the poor little unprepared Phocians, they realize that the Phocians retreat to a nearby mountaintop and prepare to meet their end because there's an overwhelming Persian force there. However, Herodotus informs us that the Persians did also not expect to meet anyone up there, so they were surprised and originally thought they were Lacedaemonians, but when they realized they were not Lacedaemonians, they descended on to attack the Hellenic forces at Thermopylae rather than to engage in a proper battle with the Phocians on top of the mountains, who then retreated. Herodotus does not tell us what happened to the Phocian forces after this. However, it's likely they retreat back to Phocis to warn the Phocians of what is to come, as many other Greeks do as soon as they see that the Persian forces have found a way around them. Several of the Hellenic contingents thus do this and travel back to the respective cities in central Greece and the Peloponnese, while some, such as the famous 300 and the Thespians, they decide to remain behind. The Spartans, presumably because the Delphic oracle had given a prophecy that the Spartan king would either die at this battle or Sparta itself would be invaded. So, kill a king, invaded city, good choice. So the Phocians had been used to put to guard the paths over Thermopylae, and a defensive structure in Locris that at this point was associated with the Phocians had been used to help the defenses against the Persians. Therefore, strong elements of the Phocian identity had proven important of structures and things that were considered Phocian had been important during the Battle of Thermopylae, and therefore elements of Phocian identity was already used at this point in Xerxes' invasion. The next time Herodotus talks of the Phocians is in 827. I promise I will have more of this quote coming up. It's not just these two lines, where he discusses the immediate effects after the Battle of Thermopylae. And here he says that the Thessalians sent a herald on behalf of the Persians to the Phocians. And it's through this account, as you can see from these two lovely lines, that the rivalry and hatred between the Phocians and Thessalians allegedly goes into time immemorial. Now, that the rivalry between the two goes into time immemorial is interesting, as one of the two eponymous heroes of Phocis, Phocus from Corinth, has undeniable link to Thessaly. Although his father Orynthian, son of Sisyphus, Sisyphus being son of Aeolus, which is associated with Thessaly. Further, another mythological king of Phocis was another son of Aeolus called Dionys, which was a mythological Dionys, and whilst Herodotus claims the rivalry between the Phocians and the Thessalian dates to times immemorial, it is undeniable that Phocis had mythological links to Aeolis and Thessaly. Yet it is important to highlight that when talking of Sisyphus, we often think of Corinth rather than Thessaly, and those a connection to this focus could be considered a method of distancing themselves from Thessaly and connecting themselves to the rich polis of Corinth and their expansionist period in the 8th and 7th century, as well as in the 6th century. It might also be the story that the story develops later, but personally, I think because of the influence of Corinth early on, it is likely that they would have tried to claim a connection already in the archaic period. We can also see the rivalry between the two through Phocis' second eponymous hero, which is Phocis from Aegina, as he is murdered by his brother Peleus, who later settled in Phocian Thessaly. Hence, when Phocis from Aegina was adopted in Phocis in the 6th century, the rivalry between the Phocians and the Thessalian were personified through the heroes Phocis from Aegina and Peleus, as Peleus was associated with a part of Thessaly and he had murdered their eponymous hero. This is the oldest mention that we have of Phocis, son of Phoenician, son of Sisyphus, which is a Hellenistic travel writer. Right. The next time Herodotus refers to a battle, nevertheless, Herodotus does refer to a battle which he suggests having taken place only a few years before Circe's invasion of Greece, which I think we should date up to the Phocian rebellion against Thessalian dominance, so sometime around 510. And according to the story as told by Herodotus, the Phocians were trapped on a height of Mount Parnassus, presumably Titarea, as that is a recurring place for the Phocians to retreat to. And a seer called Teleas of Elis comes up with a brilliant plan, which I come back to shortly. Because one problem with Herodotus' account here is that he doesn't tell us why the Phocians are trapped on Titarea at this point, which I have a suggestion for in. Sorry, my PowerPoint's acting up there. Which I have suggestions for here from later sources such as Plutarch and Aeschines. As Plutarch might be quite a bit of a later source, but he suggests that the Phocians captured and slaughtered all of the Thessalian leaders in Phocis, whilst Aeschines provides a similar account and suggests that the Phocians seized and flogged the Thessalian leaders, so not quite as harsh, they didn't actually murder them. Yet the two accounts do suggest that the Phocians were revolting against the Thessalians, and I personally think they should be dated back to this period. And it would explain why the Phocians were trapped at Titarea. This, I think, should be seen as a strategy for them to take control over Phocis, and therefore therefore all of this should be considered to have been a plan devised in the upcoming years before these events. But as I said, before the battle, a seer named Teleas of Elis came up with a plan about how to defeat the overwhelming Thessalian forces in the famous shock battle of Mount Parnassus. The plan he devised was to cover 600 of their bravest men in shock and to attack the Thessalian aggressors. Again, often portrayed as an impulsive act, but it could be considered a calculated plan hatched by the Phocians to gain control and to drive the Thessalians out. The Phocians as a group seems to have done this as a unity in the sources, and therefore this becomes a big part of their origin stories and their national saga. And after having defeated the Thessalians from this stronghold at Titarea, half the spoils are dedicating at the sanctuary of Apollo at Abai in Phocis, and the other half at Delphi, probably strategically chosen sanctuaries, as Delphi is one of the most important Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, and it is located within the Phocian cultural zone. Whilst Abe is a crucial local sanctuary also for Apollo, which was located near the borders against the Puntian Locris and the corridor presumably used in their semi-mythological conquest of the ethnos earlier on, as hinted to at Strabo. Now, I'm going to diverge from the narrative a little bit and talk about the significance of Thyterea in this context. As mentioned, Thyterea is a height at Mount Parnassus. Over Apollo is called Neon, which later on changes its name to Thyterea. And to be considered one of the most important central positions. And according to Pausanias, Phocus from Corinth came across from Corinth, and after a stay at Delphi and helping the Phocians conquer the corridor to Daphnis, he settled in Thyterea, so it's a site that to the Phocians, at least later on, has associations with one of their main heroes. And it is quite a strategic, quite a defensive place on the mountain, which throughout their history was quite often used as a defense for the Phocians when attacked by larger, stronger enemies from outside. So it is also probable that after the Phocians after the Phocians had retreated from Thermopylae, numerous of them took refuge here, whilst others fled to Amphissa. Herodotus then goes on to, here's another lovely map. Herodotus then goes on to the next battle, which is the Battle of the Amphorae, which took place outside Hermopolis, again, near the sanctuary of Apollo at Abai, and thus an important sanctuary for the local Phocian identity, where the spoils taken from the Thessalians in the chalk battle have been dedicated. And this was the last stand of the Phocians against the Thessalians before the Persian Wars, and compromised another ingenious plan, just like at the Battle of Mount Parnassus. The plan was easy enough. The Phocians buried jars in the ground near Hermopolis, and the Thessalians arriving with their famous cavalry. Let's just say horses doesn't like broken glass, so it didn't go very well for them. The Thessalians, when they arrived, did believe themselves to be a stronger party, though, and believed that this would be an easy ordeal. However, horses and broken glass doesn't work, as I said. So the Phocians once more defeated the Thessalians. Later sources do talk of events which is associated as the Phocian desperation next to this, but these are presumably events later added in to create a more epic origin story. But these two events becomes crucial parts of the origin or national story or saga of the Phocians, as it is presumably because of the Thessalian dominance in the region that the smaller localized ethnic group became the Phocians in the 6th century, largely because the Thessalian pressure from outside. Of the ethnia that had been in the area from before, the Cragelidae faded into memory and only became represented by Croesus or Crisa, which can be associated as a polis of them earlier on, whilst the Phlegians becomes a sub-regional identity in eastern and southern Phocis. So the account of Herodotus also suggests that these battles does have an impact on the Thessalian identity, as defeats can have an equal impact on identity as victories can. And he suggests they are quite bitter against this. So yeah, here you see the location of Hermopolis within Phocis. And so in this quote, which is what Herodotus constructs as the message from the Thessalians that the Thessalians are delivering to the Phocians after the Battle of Thermopylae. They go, "Men of Phocis, now more than ever, you must admit that you are no match for us. In times past, while we choose to be on the side of the Greeks, we always meant more to them than you did. And now we have sided with the Persians. We have so much influence that we could have robbed you of your land and reduced you to slavery as well. We can do anything we like with you, but we do not hold the wrongs you have done us in the past against you." There's another line here where he adds in that, "unless you pay us this money." But this line shows that the Thessalians, despite the fact that they claim towards the end of it, they claim that there is no hard feelings over past losses, but it's quite obvious from it that the Thessalians does hold a grudge over it, and this does have an impact on this confidence in the Thessalian as an identity as well. Because again, setbacks can have an equally strong impact as victories. However, Herodotus suggests that the Phocians refused to take this offer, as seen by the fact that the majority of the polis that the Thessalian and Persian armies came across on their invasion were sacked. But Herodotus does suspect that the Phocians is only on the side of the Greeks because the Thessalians happens to be on the side of the Persians, as seen from this quote, which reads, "In other words, if the Thessalians had supported the Greek cause, the Phocians would, I am sure, have collaborated with the Persians. Anyway, in response to this offer from the Thessalians, the Phocians refused to pay any money. They also said they could match the Thessalians as collaborators if for some reason they chose to, but that they could not deliberately betray Greece. Thus, if Herodotus' accounts of the Phocians in the early 5th century should be considered accurate, then the Phocians were confident enough in the group to believe they could match the contributions of the Thessalians. And Herodotus does seem to think that the Phocian dislike for the Phocians was strong enough as a reason for them to have chosen to fight on the side of the Thessalians, to fight, or they would fight on any side where the Thessalians were not. So, however, Plutarch later criticized Herodotus for making this suggestion and uses several examples, such as you can see in the list he has here: the Chalcidians and the Eritreans, Corinthians, Megarians, of arch rivals in Greece who put down the differences to join a common cause against the Persians, and therefore he thinks that Herodotus here is just putting his own critique onto his own spin on the Phocians here, and that the Phocians aren't really would not necessarily have fought on the Persian side if the Thessalians had fought on the Hellenic side. But it's also telling that Herodotus included this for the Phocian identity, as it shows how famous the hatred between the Thessalians and the Phocians are at this point. And that it has become a crucial aspect of both the Phocian and the Thessalian ethnos, these two lines that I showed from, that is attributed to the Thessalians and to the Phocians. The next thing that happens in Herodotus' account is quite interesting, because apparently, instead of following the normal route along the coast of East Locris, the Thessalian leads the Persian troops through Trachis and Doris into Phocis, leaves Doris alone because Doris has been friendly to the Persians, and so there's no reasons to attack them at this point. There's also a relatively small group. But the route chosen to go through Trachis and Doris is quite a significant thing for the Thessalians to lead them through, because through leading them to that, it's worth suggesting that this is done by the Thessalians to put as much harm on the Phocians as possible, as if it had gone along the coast of East Locris, and through a pass further south, they would have skipped all of the upper Cephisus Valley, where a lot of smaller Phocian settlements are based. Yet, so it does really show Phocian lust for vengeance against Thessalian lust for vengeance against the Phocians. Yet much of the population of Phocis had already managed to flee either up Mount Parnassus to places like Titouria or to Ampisa, and such escaped complete destruction. However, let's see. But yeah, so as I said, it is quite obviously a route picked to leave as much damage as possible, and they just attack every Phocian polis they come across on their way down towards Boeotia, including the sanctuary at Abai, which is where the Phocians had dedicated the spoils from the choke battle at Mount Parnassus. Now, when they reach Panopeus, the Persian army, according to Herodotus, splits into two parts. One that goes towards Delphi, and one that goes towards Boeotia. Herodotus is mentioning that the army on the way to Boeotia then said that Panopeus, Daulis, and Aulidae in particular is mentioned after the army splits as polis that get sacked. The last of those are quite interesting, as Aulidae wasn't rebuilt, presumably because its name draws connections to the descendants of Aeolus and Thessaly, so it is not a name that would instead stood strong in Thessaly, in Phocis, sorry. The two others are in later sources associated with Phocians, and presumably represented the Phocians as a sub-regional identity within Phocis. Now, in the quotes I have here, we can see the Phocian contribution, the Phocian contribution towards the, as an aspect of the identity, as the supposed heroic assistance to Delphi received when the Persian troops were approaching them. According to traditions reported by Herodotus, two local heroes, Phylacus, which presumably has relations to the Phocians, and Autonus came to the aid of the Delphians, and after some divine assistance, represented by thunderbolts and boulders falling off the mountain, these two heroes chased the remaining Persian army that was marching on Delphi away. Phylacus should here be considered a personification of the Phocian ethnos, and he is later on he is in the catalogue of women put in as a son of Deianus, an early mythological king of Phocis. Thus, the story had powerful connections to the evolution of the Phocian ethnos, and it is necessary to say here that this story was presumably invented to explain why Delphi was not sacked by the Persians, rather than being something that took place. As earlier in the histories, Herodotus revealed that the Delphi wasn't too keen on taking a strong side in the war, so they needed explanations to why they weren't sacked, and this was it. Because this story allowed them to escape any accusation of Medicing. And then over to the Battle of Plataea, the discussion of the Battle of Plataea. First, in Book 9, chapter 17, it is revealed that 1,000 Phocians does arrive at Thebes to support the Persian troops. This should be considered Phocians that are abandoning the Phocian stand and choose to join the Persian army. And according to Herodotus, the Persian armies are, the Persian looks like they're about to attack these, which led the leader Harmukides to hold a speech for his men, which you can see here on the slide. And again, this is a speech constructed by Herodotus on behalf of Phocian commander. Nevertheless, it's telling how important the anti-Thessalian aspect of the Phocian ethnos was conceived by Herodotus, suggesting that the Phocians were ready to believe that Thessalians would lie with the aim of wiping out the Phocian troops. The Persians seem to attack, and thus the Phocians enter defensive position. However, the Persians pull back in order from Mardonius, and it's conceivable that he did this to test the bravery of the Phocians, as his principal source of information about them was Thessalians, which would not have spoken highly of them because they are not very friendly. And this is Mardonius's answer to the Phocians after this. So it was seen that the Phocians had joined, that some Phocians had joined the Persian army. However, a fair portion of the Phocians would have been based still in the mountains around Mount Parnassus, and thus raided the Persian army from behind, and also Greek allies of the Persians. So what can Herodotus tell us about the evolution of the Phocian ethnos in the early 5th century? Well, except the list of the polis sacked by the Persians on the way to Phocis, and the reference to the rivalry between the Thessalians and Phocians, Herodotus does not reference to individual Phocian communities. We can suggest several reasons to this. Firstly, Herodotus might not understand the inner workings of the Phocian ethnos and region. Secondly, and more likely, is that Herodotus was writing of the Phocian ethnos as in the early 5th century, they were considered enough of a new unity to be considered under one umbrella. Though through the account of Herodotus, we can decipher that the Phocians, as we know them, was established as an ethnos by the late 6th century and definitely strengthened in the early 5th century. And we can also, through Herodotus' account, see the importance of the topography of the Phocians, just as putative common backgrounds and othering, both constructed through the wars with the Phocians and the Thessalians. Another important aspect is territory and topographical features, and we can see this in the discussion of the Phocian War, which alludes to a semi-mythological past when the Phocians had control in this part of central Greece, which is also in central Greece, and also the heights of Mount Parnassus, and especially Titarea as a time of refugee, as a place of refugee and defense.